Good morning, YouTube. I've been telling you almost all of these videos I make, I tell you that I've been up since the dawn. Well, not today. I decided to sleep in. I took my Monday and chose to give it an extra 2 hours of sleep. So I hope that you are having whatever, whenever, wherever you are. I hope you're doing well. That's what I want you to know. We are continuing with another episode of the Something to Do, parenthetical about nothing, close parenthetical podcast. And today we are going to be approaching a primer on Greek oratory and the oral storytelling tradition as it was evolving, as literacy was becoming more and more regular in the Greek world of the 7th century BCE, I think. I always get my centuries wrong. Never quote me when I say somebody is in a certain century. Never think that I'm perfect on that. In fact, if I'm wrong, let me know because I need the correction. And so, what we're going to do is, because I have a fantastic and admirable young Patreon subscriber named Mr. S, who shall and will remain nameless, who supports my work financially. And so because of that, I can afford to do things like ask an AI. Well, I understand the rhetorical and the oratory and the oral storytelling traditions. I understand them very well because I've invested hundreds, maybe even thousands of dollars into books, reading them and listening to people explain them to me from the positions of authority. And the AI suggested that I read a book to you that would not be useful, and then suggested to you, or to me, that I read the funeral oration of Pericles. Now, that's something I've done on my Patreon, but I listened to it recently, and the way that I attempted to read it was like other modern orators, modern readers for audiobooks, and I can hear how frustrated I'm getting with that very style early, and probably annoyed with the free translation that I have. So I invested $1 in the book that is actually going to be down here in this recording. I downloaded and bought for myself a copy of Thucydides, or Thucydides, or as I like to say it in my head, Thucydides, because it sounds Hittite or Mesopotamian. But anyway, Thucydides is someone who's famous. I know his name. I don't know why I know his name. It turns out he wrote a history of the Peloponnesian Wars. So here's the thing. I may or may not be interested in / invested in your education in the ancient world. And so if I'm thinking about this like I'm talking directly to Mr. S, and yeah, you know, sometimes the crazy person hair thing is just going to happen because I kind of like it. And so just cope. Anyway, if I'm invested in your education in the Greek world, what I'm not going to tell you is that I'm an expert on the Peloponnesian War. I know that war was between Athens and Sparta, I think, but I really don't know. And so now I have the history of the Peloponnesian War by Thucydides, but I'm not reading it in its entirety for this podcast. You may or may not have noticed that my intellectual pursuit often leaves me reading many different things all at the same time, and then rereading the things that sent me to the branching readings that I'm doing. It's difficult to describe. So what I'm going to do is we're going to read Book 2, Chapter 6, as my translation calls it, of the Peloponnesian War. And so what that means is that we're going to be reading the subchapters: the beginning of the Peloponnesian War, the first invasion of Attica, which is where Athens is, and the funeral oration of Pericles. The funeral oration of Pericles is what I want you to listen to. So if you're that kind of person that's like, I only want to hear the thing that you want me to listen to, I don't want the setup, and I don't want to hear you work your way toward learning things, there is a non-zero chance that I'm not going to give you chapter headers in this so that you can just go fuck yourself. Now, that's not a productive way for me to be a public person. It's not a good way for me to be a YouTuber, and I know it's not going to grow my channel. But you were never going to subscribe to the Patreon. And this isn't about growing my YouTube channel. This is about growing my Patreon community. So you have me inside out and upside down, not me having my approach upside down and inside out. I know what I'm doing. Okay, thank you for still being here, Mr. S. Let's continue with Book 2, as my translation calls it, Chapter 6 of Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War. And I gotta warn you right now, it is warm in here, so I'm going to start to sweat and I'm going to get uncomfortable. And I only have about 20 minutes, according to my phone, of hardware space, so we'll just see how this goes. And I might end up reading this in chunks across the day, because I can edit these videos now. And if I can get a second subscriber at greater than $20 a month, what I'll do with that money, and I pledge it right now, if I can get more than $25 a month with another pledge, I'll actually spend that money on CapCut, which means that effectively your pledge, so long as you are subscribed to the channel, will be paying for CapCut for me so that I can edit these, and maybe someone who cares about that will stick around and tell their friends. But first they have to do the other thing. You see how this works? I don't think it's intuitive to you, and I know I'm not doing a good job of communicating what my goods and services are. Until you pay me minimum $10 on the Patreon, and then we can talk about it and the emails on there and the chat set up, and then you can ask me questions and say, why am I here again? And I can remind you. And you can also see the 300 posts that are over there. You see what I'm saying? Okay, beginning. The war between the Athenians and the Peloponnesians and the allies on either side now really begins. Now, understand something. This is the shaggy dog part of it. This was written down, but reading until very recently was not something that people did by themselves in their minds. Like, your discomfort with, I just don't find reading comfortable. I find it a lot of a mental attention. I find it distracting. I want to get up. I want to do things, that feeling. Yeah, that's a recent phenomenon. These works were recorded to be read aloud. And so that they were written down was trying to capture the purest grammatical way to get to what you were saying. So in Phaedrus, episode 2 of this podcast, Socrates says, well, the grammar's great, but he repeats himself a lot about his argument. And that's the thing, is like Phaedrus is like, the grammar is so great. The words he chooses and the grammar, it's so great. And Socrates is like, yeah, but the argument sucks my ass. You see what I'm saying? Okay, so, I shouldn't have done that. I'm sorry. I have nervous tics and one of them is checking the time. Okay. So this story is being read aloud, probably by Thucydides himself, in public places in Athens, like at parties or in the market square for tips. Okay, maybe that helps you see the connection between what I'm doing and what you're doing. The war between the Athenians and the Peloponnesians, and the allies on either side, now really begins. For now all intercourse except through the medium of heralds ceased, and hostilities were commenced and prosecuted without intermission. The history follows the chronological order of events by summers and winters. The 30 years' truce, which was entered into after the conquest of Euboea, lasted 14 years, in the 15th and the 48th year of the priestess-ship of Chrysis at Argos, that's Chrysys, that might be pronounced better, Crucis, at Argos, in the Ephorate at Anesius, at the Ephorate of Anesius at Sparta, in the last month, but 2 of the archonship of Pythodorus at Athens, and 6 months after the battle of Pitydea, just at the beginning of spring, a Theban force a little over 300 strong, under the command of their boetarchs Pythangelus, which kind of means the messenger of the Pythia, son of Philades, and Diamporus, son of Onotorides, about the first watch of the night, made an armed entry into Plataea, a town of Boeotia, in alliance with Athens. And you understand what he's saying here, that under all of the flowery oratory dressings and the references to gods and all of these historical references that show you that he knows what he's talking about, right? To an Athenian person, you and I don't know what he's talking about, but because he is saying all these things, he must. This is what we do when we read fantasy literature, fiction, so I feel like it's appropriate to do with history as well. I have ants crawling around my tent and they're distracting. There's nothing for them to find in here, and so they're trying to get back out, and I want to let them, but also, like, I don't want to open the flap and invite other things in. Tent life! The gates were open to them, and so anyway, these people have attacked this other people. The gates were opened to them by a Plataean named Naucleides, who, with his party, had invited them in, meaning to put to death the citizens of the opposite party, bring over the city to Thebes, and thus obtain power for themselves. This was arranged through Eurymachus, son of Leontiades, a person of great influence at Thebes. For Plataea had always been at variance with Thebes, and the latter, foreseeing that war was at hand, wished to surprise her old enemy in time of peace, before hostilities had actually broken out. Indeed, this was how they got in so easily, without being observed, as no guard had been posted. After the soldiers had grounded arms in the marketplace, those who had those who had invited them in, wished them to set to work at once and go to their enemies' houses. This, however, the Thebans refused to do, but determined to make a conciliatory proclamation, and, if possible, to come to a friendly understanding with the citizens. Their herald accordingly invited any who wished to resume their old place in the confederacy of their countrymen to ground arms with them, and for they thought that in this way the city would readily join them. On becoming aware of the presence of the Thebans within their gates, and of the sudden occupation of the town, the Plataeans concluded in their alarm that more had entered than was really the case, the night preventing their seeing them. They accordingly came to terms, and, accepting the proposal, made no movement, especially as the Thebans offered none of them any violence. But somehow or other, during the negotiations, they discovered the scanty numbers of the Thebans, and decided that they could easily attack and overpower them, the mass of the Plataeans being averse to revolting from Athens. At all events, they resolved to attempt it. Digging through the party walls of the houses, they thus managed to join each other without being seen, going through the streets, in which they placed wagons without the beasts in them, to serve as a barricade, and arranged everything else as seemed convenient for the occasion. And okay, so you understand what they're saying. They're like, wait a minute, these are a lot fewer people than we thought. They're in one building. Let's bar it up with a wagon. And you know what's really funny to me is if you're playing or watching anyone play that game right now, Schedule 1. If you're watching anybody play Schedule 1, you can totally jank out the game. You can totally cheat by parking a car in front of the police station before they come out for the day. And that's what they're doing here. I think that's funny. When everything had been done that circumstances permitted, they watched their opportunity and went out of their houses against the enemy. It was still night, though daybreak was at hand. In daylight, it was thought that their attack would be met by men full of courage and on equal terms with their assailants, while in darkness it would fall upon panic-stricken troops, who would also be at a disadvantage from their enemy's knowledge of the locality. So they made their assault at once and came to close quarters as quickly as they could. The Thebans, finding themselves outwitted, immediately closed up to repel all attacks made against them. Twice or thrice they beat back their assailants, but the men shouted and charged them. The women and slaves screamed and yelled from the houses and pelted them with stones and tiles. Besides, it had been raining hard all night, and so at last their courage gave way, and they turned and fled through the town. Most of the fugitives were quite ignorant of the right ways out, and this, with the mud and the darkness caused by the moon being in her last quarter, and the fact that their pursuers knew their way about and could easily stop their escape, proved fatal to many. The only gate open was the one by which they had entered, and this was shut by one of the Plataeans driving the spike of a javelin into the bar instead of the bolt. And so you understand that Thucydides is Athenian. The Thebans are the bad guys. And so he's reveling in how they come into this town, they cause a problem, and then these people cut them down to a man inside the walls of their town because of treachery. And so if you know the story of the Iliad, right, you know that Odysseus is a Greek culture hero because he employs treachery to win the Trojan War. And that's what Odysseus, the Odyssey, is about. I did a reading of that for YouTube as well that you can find on my profile. And in that, I talk about how the book actually makes a point to have Poseidon say with his own mouth, Homer has Poseidon say with his own mouth, that Troy was Poseidon's favorite city. That's why the Odyssey is happening. Poseidon isn't going to kill Odysseus to punish him, and he's not going to trap him in an eternal afterlife because he's a hero. He gets to go to the heroic afterlife in that book. You understand? That book, by the way, predates this book by many hundreds of years. That's the point. And so you might think, oh wow, that's kind of fucked up to lock a guy up effectively in your house and then chase him around with a sword until you finally catch him and then to enjoy killing him. But it's also like, yeah, this is many centuries ago. They had different opinions about things. And to the Greeks, treachery, the Judas kiss, at this time, 600 years or whatever, 700 years before Jesus, isn't betrayal. You understand? It's not bad. They don't think it's bad. They're reveling in it. We wouldn't. I'm not asking you to. Be appalled if you like. They're not. They're proud of what these people did. The most numerous and compact body rushed into a large building next to the city wall. The doors on the side of the street happened to be open, and the Thebans fancied that they were the gates of the town and that there was a passage right through to the outside. The Plataeans, who are allies of the Athenians, seeing their enemies in a trap, now consulted whether they should set fire to the building and burn them, just as they were, or whether there was anything else that they could do with them, until at length these and the rest of the Theban survivors found wandering about the town agreed to an unconditional surrender of themselves and their arms, armor, and weapons to the Plataeans. While such was the fate of the party in Plataea, the rest of the Thebans, who were to have joined them with all their forces before daybreak, in case of anything miscarrying with the body that had entered, received the news of the affair on the road and pressed forward for their succor. Now you have to understand something. While mythological, while a myth in that it is a story with a narrative in the language of the Greeks of this time, that's what muthon means, is it's a story with plot points, a beginning and an end. A narrative is a myth. And so while this is a myth, it's also history in the fact that it's an investigation. So what he did is he interviewed a lot of people to get this story. And so he's telling you that this is nonfiction. This is what happened. These are the details. Now, Plataea is nearly 8 miles from Thebes, and you got to remember, he's telling this to people like alive when it happened, so he couldn't make things up. Plataea is nearly 8 miles from Thebes, and their march delayed by the rain that had fallen in the night, for the river Asopus had risen and was not easy of passage. And so, having to march in the rain, and being hindered in crossing the river, they arrived too late, and found the whole party either slain or captive. When they learned what had happened, they at once formed a design against the Plataeans outside the city. As the attack had been made in time of peace and was perfectly unexpected, there were of course men and stock in the fields, and the Thebans wished, if possible, to have some prisoners to exchange against their countrymen in the town. Should any chance to have been taken alive. Such was their plan. But the Plataeans suspected their intention almost before it was formed, and, becoming alarmed for their fellow citizens outside the town, sent a herald to the Thebans, reproaching them for their unscrupulous attempt to seize their city in time of peace, and warning them against any outrage on those outside. Should the warning be disregarded, they threatened to put to death the men they had in their hands, but added that, on the Thebans retiring from their territory, they would surrender the prisoners to their friends. This is the Theban account of the matter, and they say that they had an oath given them. And then, here you go. Thucydides actually, he like played up the drama. Like they killed a lot of them, but they also captured a bunch too. Like they were ethical. It wasn't just outright slaughter. You see what I'm saying? This is the Theban account of the matter, and they say that they had an oath given them. The Plataeans, on the other hand, do not admit any promise of an immediate surrender, but make it contingent upon subsequent negotiation. The oath they deny altogether. Be this as it may, upon the Thebans retiring from their territory without committing any injury, the Plataeans hastily got in whatever they had in the country and immediately put the men to death. Okay, so you understand what's happening here. What Thucydides does is he opens up this chapter, this book, effectively, that's what it's called, by saying, here's what happened. Okay, now the sides of the war disagree. Here's what they say happened, here's what they say happened, but here is what happened. The Plataeans, no matter what the Thebans say they were promised, did kill their captives. The prisoners were 180 in number, Eurymachus, the person with whom the traitors had negotiated, being one. This done, the Plataeans sent a messenger to Athens, gave back the dead to the Thebans under a truce, and arranged things in the city as seemed best to meet the present emergency. The Athenians, meanwhile, having had word of the affair, sent them immediately after its occurrence, had instantly seized all the Boeotians in Attica, and sent a herald to the Plataeans to forbid their proceeding to extremities with their Theban prisoners without instructions from Athens. And so, like, you know how in the United States during World War II there were like the seize the enemy citizens in prison camps thing? That's what's happening here. Like, the Americans didn't make that shit up. And what Athens did is they used all of the citizens in their city from Thebes as hostages to negotiate an end to this war before it broke out. The news of the men's death had, of course, not arrived, the first messenger having left Plataea just when the Thebans entered it, the second just after their defeat and capture. So there was no later news. Thus, the Athenians sent orders in ignorance of the facts, and the herald, on his arrival, found the men slain. After this, the Athenians marched to Plataea and brought in provisions, and left a garrison in the place, also taking away the women and children and such of the men as were least deficient. After the affair at Plataea, the treaty had been broken by an overt act, and Athens at once prepared for war, as did also Lacedaemon and her allies. They resolved to send embassies to the king and to such other of the barbarian powers as either party could look to for assistance, and tried to ally themselves with the independent states at home. Lacedaemon, in addition to the existing marine, gave orders to the states that had declared for her in Italy and Sicily to build vessels up to a grand total of 500, the quota of each city being determined by its size, and also to provide a specified sum of money. And so you understand what he's saying here. He's saying that in addition to their own marine forces, that is their own soldiers that fought in phalanx style but on boats, they levied their allies and their vassal cities not only for money but also for naval troops. Till these were ready, they were to remain neutral and to admit single Athenian ships into their harbors. Athens, on her part, reviewed her existing confederacy and sent embassies to the places more immediately round Peloponnese. Corcyra, Cephallenia, Acarnania, and Zacynthus. Perceiving that if these could be relied on, she could carry the war all round Peloponnese. And if both sides nourished the boldest hopes and put forth their utmost strength for the war, this was only natural. Zeal is always at its height at the commencement of an undertaking, and on this particular occasion, Peloponnese and Athens were both full of young men whose inexperience made them eager to take up arms, while the rest of Hellas stood straining with excitement at the conflict of its leading cities. It's important here that I dwell on that phrase, that quote there, that Zeal is always the highest. That the commencement of any undertaking is that's a famous idiom in English. People quote that all the time when they're talking about anything, especially when they're talking about the histories. But it's true. It's true even in myself. Like zeal for the last sandcastle, right, was obviously at its height while I was still in the formulaic, there we go, formula building processes. Why? Because that's the easiest part, right? That's the part that's most fluid from ideal to product, something that you can begin to manipulate. And so this is continuing to establish metamaterial for the Phaedrus. I'm trying to help you understand rhetoric, and I'm trying to help you understand the Greek people that Plato is talking to, right? And so the idea that this is an older man saying that the city of Athens was full of young people, what that means is he's foreshadowing that this zeal for this war is not going to go on for very long because it's driven by young people. And he does say Peloponnese instead of... He means Sparta, right? He's talking about Sparta. Sparta's just one city. Everywhere predictions were being recited and oracles being chanted by such persons as collect them. And this not only in the contending cities. You understand here he means that the people who go around and memorize oracles and things, they're being recited in the city to people. Maybe professionally, maybe semi-professionally, maybe as gossip, but maybe also as current events, like we would do later with news. Criers, right? Literally people who collect gossip or collect news and then yell it out into the city would be yelling out these oracles too. And so you can sort of imagine the conflict between Babylon and Jerusalem in this way. It wouldn't have been happening in the Greek language. It would have been happening in Semitic languages like Hebrew. But you could really see the prophets in the Hebrew tradition in this way. They're not people who collect oracle. They're the people who yell it out in public. That's what profess means. It means like this sort of vomiting forth of speech that's not yours, sort of like ectoplasmic wisdom, right? And the idea is that it's coming from God, it's coming from the panpsychic universe, and so it's just true, and it's also about the future. If you don't stop this effect will happen. That's what's in the prophecies, and so I'm going to read the Bible once I get my phone charged up. While my battery, if I might set out on the patio at Panera today, and definitely tomorrow. I'm going to read some prophecy from the Bible to build this out, because tomorrow is Sunday, I think. Tomorrow might be Saturday. Today is Saturday. So yeah. Further, some while before this, that should be one word. Further, some while before this, there was an earthquake at Delos, for the first time in the memory of the Hellenes. This was said and thought to be ominous of the kinds or of the events impending. Ominous meaning that ominous doesn't necessarily mean bad. In this case, it does. It means a foreshadowing or an omen of a bad outcome. But all it means is that this was an omen of some sort. Indeed, nothing of the kind that happened was allowed to pass without remark. And so that means that everybody had an opinion. The good wishes of men made greatly for the Lacedaemonians, especially as they proclaim themselves the liberators of Hellas. And so you have to understand here that we haven't read the first chapter, but basically what's happening is that Athens is too powerful, and the rest of Greece, which calls itself Hellas, all of the Greek-speaking colonies, they don't exactly love the way that Athens is leading what was once called the Hellenic League and is now the Athenian League. And so Sparta's got something to say about it, and those are the Lacedaemonians. And so most everybody is like, yeah, we want the Lacedaemonians or the Spartans to win this war, them and their allies, even if we're vassaled to Athens. And the Lacedaemonians, the reason they had such public goodwill everywhere but in Athens, the city itself, is because they proclaimed themselves liberators. And so if you were alive, if you were an educated, or if you were a person above the age of 5, circa 2001, you can kind of remember this, that George W. Bush expected to walk into Iraq heralded by all of the states around Iraq as a liberator, and by the 3 major people groups who live in Iraq as liberators, and that is not what happened. Only one of those people groups reacted that way. Everybody else around them, in a big old spiral all the way back to Russia, saw that as an invasion and an imposition of American-style government in the Middle East. Continuing. No private or public effort that could help them in speech or action was omitted, each thinking that the cause suffered wherever he could, not himself to see it. So general was the indignation felt against Athens, whether by those who wished to escape from her empire or were apprehensive of being absorbed by it. Everyone had an opinion. Such were the preparations and such the feelings with which the contest opened. And so I compare this back to the United States again, because Afghanistan knew what was coming next. And the rest of the Middle East knew exactly what was coming next, because it had been on the game board since Russia positioned themselves as major backers of Afghanistan subsequent, or maybe even during, World War II. So as soon as Russia got control of the opium and the weed in Afghanistan, you had to know that the United States was going to establish colonies, American-style dictatorships, but American-style governments in the Middle East in exactly the way we did in the Pacific, the way we did in Japan and Vietnam and Korea and the Polynesia and Hawaii and China during the Opium Wars. And this is you have to understand that a country has a character, and that characters make similar decisions over time, and they have a similar internal logic over time. This is what makes good serial fiction interesting. This is what makes what I'm doing interesting, is that people are the same over time because they have a character. And so the more authentic they are to their character, the more they are the same in different environments. And so this is why, for instance, taking Jason and putting him in space sold, and people wanted to watch it, because Jason, the character, is going to be fundamentally the same in space. So you know what to expect from Jason, but you don't know what to expect from everything else. And so let's see how creative the writing team is. That sort of thing. So I want to read that last sentence again. So general was the indignation felt against Athens, whether by those who wished to escape from her empire or were apprehensive of being absorbed by it. Such were the preparations and such the feelings with which the contest opened. And so you can read the last 24 years of history as exactly that. There's a reason that 9/11 happened. And it was general indignation with the way that the United States during the Reagan administration had dealt with the Middle East. The allies of the two belligerents were the following. These were the allies of the Lacedaemon. It would be really easier for me if I just pronounced it Lacedaemon. But anyway, all the Peloponnesians within the isthmus, except the Argives and the Achaeans, who were neutral. Pellene being the only Achaean city that first joined in the war, though her example was afterwards followed by the rest. Now you can find yourself a map of this, and I know you're watching on video, so if you're not on a PC, you're unlikely to do that. You're unlikely to minimize me and listen to me while you look at a map, and I wouldn't even recommend looking at a map. The way I'm reading this, I know the general landmass, and I'm just imagining that this is a fantasy world and that I don't need to know these names. So moving on. Outside Peloponnese, the Megarians, Locrians, Boeotians, Phocians, Ambraciots, Leucadians, and Anactorians. Of these, ships were furnished by the Corinthians, Megarians, Sicyonians, Pellinians, Elians, Ambraciots, and Leucadians, and cavalry by the Boeotians, Phocians, and Locrians. The other states sent infantry. This was the Lacedaemonian confederacy. That of Athens comprised the Chians, Lesbians, Plataeans, the Messenians and Naupactus, most of the Acarnanians, the Corcyraeans, Zacinthians, and some tributary cities in the following countries, viz. Caria upon the sea with her Dorian neighbors, Ionia, the Hellespont, the Thracian towns, the islands lying between Peloponnese and Crete toward the east, and all the Cyclades except Melos and Thera. Of these, ships were furnished by Chios, Lesbos, Corcyra, infantry and money by the rest. Now, if you're familiar with World War II, especially the Pacific Theater, this sounds very much like the Pacific Theater in my mind. Such were the allies of either party and their resources for the war. Immediately after the affair at Plataea, Lacedaemon sent round orders to the cities in Peloponnese and the rest of her confederacy to prepare troops and the provisions requisite for a foreign campaign in order to invade Attica. Now, if you're familiar with the Greek landmass, this is whatever to you. You're just listening along, and you're annoyed that I'm doing this now. If you're unfamiliar with the Greek landmass, what you need to understand is that what Thucydides is doing here is he's establishing that the Lacedaemons are surrounded on three sides. Actually, if you break up the wheel into 8, I think it's 8. Yeah, if you break up the compass into 8, they're surrounded on like 5 sides. They have themselves, but these islands around them are also surrounding them on some level. And then they have Thrace up. I think it's Thrace up to the northwest, and so like they're kind of pinned into in a corner down here in the bottom of Greece. Now, marching to Athens is a short spot, but if you're thinking about this on a war game board, what you have to remember is that Athens doesn't make decisions for its city-states, for its empire, right? Neither did the United States with its allies in World War II. Okay, and so what the Lacedaemons are counting on is that as they march across to Athens, that their allies are going to be risky enough a proposition to defend themselves from these islanders being able to hop marine soldiers from boats directly onto their towns. Because we're not talking about towns with garrisons yet, right? You have to think in terms of old school Total War to know what I'm talking about, or even maybe older school Civ, where if you put a soldier on an undefended city, you just own it now, because there's nobody to fight back against people with real weapons. This is the context that we're talking about in this time period. So it's not really a long march up to Athens, is what he's saying. But we've got all these allied city-states that Sparta is counting on not actually invading. He's the kings of Sparta, these military people, the advisors, all these councils, what they're counting on is the empire of Athens hating Athens so much that nobody wants to risk their future as young people to defend what Athens stands for. This is why I'm saying that when we read Plato and we read the Phaedrus, we cannot read Plato like modern Hellenophiles. We have to read Plato like a then modern Athenian. And what was modern to Athenians during and after this war was extreme criticism of what Athens stood for. We're 25 years almost now removed from 9/11. Young people today only know to be critical of what the United States once stood for as a character. We are at a major civilizational turning point. We are at a major empirical ego death moment, and we lack religion. So where we go from here matters, because Athens would lose and lack religion after this. That's what Phaedrus is about. We're going to start over. Immediately after the affair at Plataea, Lacedaemon sent round orders to the cities in Peloponnese and the rest of her confederacy to prepare troops and the provisions requisite for a foreign campaign, in order to invade Attica. The several states were ready at the time appointed and assembled at the Isthmus. So here's the thing. What he's establishing is that Sparta's allies were ready to go. Everybody hated Athens. What he's suggesting is that maybe Athens' allies weren't so ready to go. The contingent of each city being 2/3 of its whole force. After the whole army had mustered the Lacedaemonian king, Archidamus, I don't know how I want to say that. Hopefully I don't have to say it too much. Archidamus, the leader of the expedition, called together the generals of all the states and the principal persons and officers and exhorted them as follows. Peloponnesians and allies, our fathers made many campaigns, both within and without Peloponnese, and the elder men among us here are not without experience in war. Now, it's important that you understand the reputation in Athens among Athenians of Lacedaemonians. You've heard maybe the word laconic to talk about people who just say what they mean without any purple. Do you understand what I mean by purple? Without any flowery embellishment or without walking around it. So this is an Athenian in an Athenian-style oral performance, oratory, presenting to you a Lacedaemonian king's laconic speech. Yet we have never set out with a larger force than the present, and if our numbers and efficiency are remarkable, so also is the power of the state against which we march. We ought not then to show ourselves inferior to our ancestors, or unequal to our own reputation. For the hopes and attention of all Hellas are bent upon the present effort, and its sympathy is with the enemy of the hated Athens. Therefore, numerous as the invading army may appear to be, and certain as some may think it, that our adversary will not meet us in the field, this is no sort of justification for the least negligence upon the march, but the officers and men of each particular city should always be prepared for the advent of danger in their own quarters. The course of war cannot be foreseen, and its attacks are generally dictated by the impulse of the moment. And where overweening self-confidence has despised preparation, a wise apprehension often being able to make head against superior numbers. Not that confidence is out of place in an army of invasion, but in an enemy's country it should also be accompanied by the precautions of apprehension. Troops will by this combination be best inspired for dealing a blow and best secured against receiving one. In the present instance, the city against which we are going, far from being so impotent for defense, is, on the contrary, most excellently equipped at all points, so that we have every reason to expect that they will take the field against us, and that if they have not set out already, before we are there, they will certainly do so when they see us in their territory wasting and destroying their property. For men are always exasperated at suffering injuries, to which they are not accustomed, and on seeing them inflicted before their very eyes, and where least inclined for reflection, rush with the greatest heat to action. The Athenians are the very people of all others to do this, as they aspire to rule the rest of the world and are most in the habit of invading and ravaging their neighbor's territory than of seeing their own treated in the like fashion. Considering, therefore, the power of the state against which we are marching and the greatness of the reputation which, according to the event, we shall win or lose for our ancestors and ourselves, remember, as you follow where you may, be led to regard discipline and vigilance as of the first importance, and to obey with alacrity, that is speed, the orders transmitted to you, as nothing contributes so much to the credit and safety of an army as the union of large bodies by a single discipline. With this brief speech, dismissing the assembly, Archidamus first sent off Melesippus, son of Diacritus, a Spartan, to Athens, in case she should be more inclined to submit on seeing the Peloponnesians actually on the march. But the Athenians did not admit into the city or to their assembly Pericles, having already carried a motion against admitting either herald or embassy from the Lacedaemonians after they had marched out. And so understand that I'm here to read for you. Ultimately, we're here to read the funeral oration of Pericles in situ, instead of out of context on my Patreon. Pericles is, I believe, the king of Athens. Now, they've probably explained the politics and his actual position in chapter 1. Book 1, in fact. The herald was accordingly sent away without an audience and ordered to be beyond the frontier that same day. In future, if those who sent him had a proposition to make, they must retire to their own territory before they dispatched embassies to Athens. An escort was sent with Melesippus, I like that, to prevent his holding communication with anyone. When he reached the frontier and was just going to be dismissed, he departed with these words: "This day will be the beginning of great misfortunes to the Hellenes." As soon as he arrived at the camp, and Archidamus learnt that the Athenians had still no thoughts of submitting, he at length began his march and advanced with his army into their territory. Meanwhile, the Boeotians, sending their contingent and cavalry to join the Peloponnesian expedition, went to Plataea with the remainder and laid waste the country. While the Peloponnesians were still mustering at the isthmus or on the march before they invaded Attica, Pericles, son of Xanthippus, one of the 10 generals of the Athenians, finding that the invasion was to take place, conceived the idea that Archidamus, who happened to be his friend, might possibly pass by his estate without ravaging it. Okay, so this is during the Decarchy, I think it's called something like that. It's like the 10 generals who ruled in a sort of formative democratic government. I don't know the specifics, obviously. I just know the general. This he might do either from a personal wish to oblige him, or acting under instructions from Lacedaemon for the purpose of creating a prejudice against him, as had been before attempted in the demand for the expulsion of the accursed family. He accordingly took the precaution of announcing to the Athenians in the assembly that, although Archidamus was his friend, yet this friendship should not extend to the detriment of the state, and that in case the enemy should make his houses and lands an exception of the rest and not pillage them, he at once gave them up to be public property, so that they should not bring him into suspicion. You understand what's happening here? That because Pericles himself, these names are difficult, they're slippery on my brain, because Pericles himself is a friend of this messenger from Sparta. What he says is, hey, you guys either don't attack my stuff at all, like ever, or you quit this. There's no other kind of like a peace that we're gonna make here. You keep fucking with us, and we won't. I won't urge retaliation if you leave my stuff alone, or we're going to full on retaliate. And then what happened is they were like, nah, we're not gonna leave your stuff alone. We're here to burn all of Attica down so that you don't have any food and you have to stop being dickheads. And so what Pericles did is he bequeathed all of his holdings, his land holdings outside of Athens. He gave them all to the city-state itself. He made them all public lands, so that if his lands weren't destroyed, by random chance, after the war, he wouldn't be blamed for asking that his land not be destroyed in this way, so that he be beyond suspicion of working to end the war in a way that only benefited him. He also gave the citizens some advice on their present affairs in the same strain as before. They were to prepare for the war and to carry in their property from the country. They were not to go out to battle, but to come into the city and guard it, and get ready their fleet, in which their real strength lay. And so, I'm going to break in again. If these generals and these kings have to explain to the people, hey, if you have stuff, and you are a citizen of this city, and you live outside the city, get into the city, or you will die. If they have to explain that this late in human history, then Jericho's walls weren't for defense. That's just not what they were for. They were also to keep a tight rein on their allies. The strength of Athens being derived from the money brought in by their payments, and success in war depending principally upon conduct and capital, had no reason to despond. And so again, we can think about the United States in the Middle East. Because we made so much money selling their goods back to them in the 80s, we thought that it would be that easy to just invade and make them profitable to us. And it turns out, gas prices have only gone up. Apart from other sources in income, an average revenue of 600 talents of silver was drawn from the tribute of the allies, and there were still 6,000 talents of coined silver in the Acropolis, out of 9,700 that had once been there, from which the money had been taken for the porch of the Acropolis, the other public buildings, and for Potidaea. This did not include the uncoined gold and silver in public and private offerings, the sacred vessels for the processions and games, the Median spoils, the similar resources to the amount of 500 talents. To this he added the treasures of the other temples. These were by no means inconsiderable, and might fairly be used. Nay, if they were ever absolutely driven to it, they might take even the gold ornaments of Athene herself. For the statue contained 40 talents of pure gold, and it was all removable. And so what you have to understand here is that the reason the cathedrals of the Middle Ages were a big deal and are no longer a big deal, and the reason the gold of the Catholic Church until Martin Luther noticed something was necessary to be in churches and not in noble people's direct use is because noble people give gold coins to whores and to foreign merchants, and churches slap it on their churches where it can be stolen by foreign enemies, and so it gives a people a thing to rally around. And that's what he's saying here. We've got an impossible amount of wealth in this city that if these people come, they are going to take. They are going to strip all of it from us. And we worked hard to collect that gold and put it in those temples. Those temples provided a lot of services over maybe 1,000 years of Athenian history up to this point to become that wealthy, to turn helping people with their mental and spiritual well-being and reading the future and funerals into these statues, into this gold, this material wealth. This might be used for self-preservation, and must every penny of it be restored. Such was their financial position, surely a satisfactory one. Then they had an army of 13,000 heavy infantry, besides 16,000 more in the garrisons and on home duty at Athens. This was at first the number of men on guard in the event of an invasion, and you see here the difference in the Peloponnesian League or Alliance, Confederacy, as it was, and the Athenian Empire, is that some of these Athenian city-states that are vassals have Athenian citizen garrisons within them, making them send their taxes to Athens, which also weakens Athens. It weakens their home garrison. It weakens their ability to defend themselves on foot from the Spartan army. This was at first the number of men on guard in the event of an invasion. It was composed of the oldest and youngest levies and the resident aliens who had heavy armor. The Phaleric Wall ran for 4 miles before it joined that round the city, and of this last nearly 5 had a guard, although part of it was left without one, viz. That between the Long Wall and the Phaleric, then there were the long walls to Piraeus, a distance of some 4 miles and a half, the outer of which was manned. Lastly, the circumference of Piraeus with Munichia was nearly 7 miles and a half. Only half of this, however, was guarded. Pericles also showed them that they had 1,200 horse, including mounted archers, with 1,600 archers unmounted, and 300 galleys fit for service. And here we're beginning to think, in my mind, about how the function of the Great Wall of China worked, and that we can see that walls by this period were actually mostly defended and manned as towers connected by a wall, extending maybe from a city or maybe just defending a means of accessing a city's farms away from the city. But again, we're describing an Athens that is spread out. If you can punch through any one of these defenses, being Spartan heavy infantry, and then their allies with their array of specializations, we can begin to think about how Genoa, with its mercenary heavy infantry and cavalry from France and Germany, but specialized navy and archers, was able to sack Constantinople a bunch of times and take their stuff for fun by the end of the Middle Ages. Like by the end of the Crusades, Genoa and Venice were sacking Constantinople for the hell of it. Like there wasn't anything even left to take. And so Constantinople is not unanalogous to Athens in this situation. You've got a city that's extremely well defended, but in real trouble if you're able to hit it through any one spot. It doesn't even have to be a weak spot. If you can hit it, it's fucked. Okay. Pericles also showed them that they had 1,200 horse, including mounted archers, with 1,600 archers unmounted, and 300 galleys fit for service. Now these horse archers, he's bringing up the horse archers because that's their main, this is going to be their main defense until shit goes real bad, is harrying their opponent. They're going to hope that their opponent doesn't have horse archers, or that their horse archers aren't as many, or aren't as accurate, aren't as skilled, and that their horse archers can that they can harry you. They can just run right outside your range to fight back and shoot you until you choose to get back on the correct side of Athens' defenses. Such were the resources of Athens in the different departments when the Peloponnesian invasion was impending and hostilities were being commenced. Pericles also urged his usual arguments for expecting a favorable issue to the war. The Athenians listened to his advice and began to carry in their wives and children from the country and all their household furniture, even to the woodwork of their houses, which they took down. Their sheep and cattle they sent over to Euboea, and the adjacent islands. But they found it hard to move, as most of them had been always used to live in the country. And now we can begin to think about like when World War II, they levied all of their boats for that movie that I didn't like, so I'm not going to remember the battle. But anyway, these peoples, their sheep and cattle they sent over to Euboea and the adjacent islands, but they found it hard to move, as most of them had always been used to live in the country. From very early times, this had been more the case with the Athenians than with others. Under Cecrops and the first kings, down to the reign of Theseus, Attica had always consisted of a number of independent townships, each with its own town hall and magistrates, what we can now call city-states, but they called themselves townships. in this translation. Except in times of danger, the king at Athens was not consulted. In ordinary seasons, they carried on their government and settled their affairs without his interference. Sometimes, even, they waged war against him, as in the case of the Eleusinians with Eumolpus against Erechtheus. In Theseus, however, they had a king of equal intelligence and power, and one of the chief features in his organization of the country was to abolish the council chambers and magistrates of the petty cities, and to merge them in the single council chamber and town hall of the present capital. Individuals might still enjoy their private property just as before, but they were henceforth compelled to have only one political center, viz., Athens, which thus counted all the inhabitants of Attica among her citizens, so that when Theseus died, he left a great state behind him. Indeed, from him dates the Synoecia, I don't know how to pronounce that, or Feast of Union, which is paid for by the state, and which the Athenians still keep in honor of the goddess. Before this, the city consisted of the present citadel and the district beneath it, looking rather towards the south. This is shown by the fact that the temples of the other deities, besides that of Athene, are in the citadel, and even those that are outside of it are mostly situated in this quarter of the city, as that of the Olympian Zeus, of the Pythian Apollo, of Earth, that is Gaia, and of Dionysus in the marshes, the same in whose honor the older Dionysia are to this day celebrated in the month of Anthesterion, not only by the Athenians, but also by their Ionian descendants. I don't exactly want to read that again, but I do want to read that again, because he said something really interesting there. I want to read some of this sentence again. Some of this paragraph again. Before this, the city consisted, that is Athens, of the present citadel. Citadel means something different in this time period than it does in the late Middle Ages, or in like Medieval II Total War. But that sounds to me, I'm going to have to talk with Gemini AI about this, actually. Give me a second, because that sounds to me like a Bronze Age hill fort.